Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Driving Innovation to Success in the Market, Strategic Considerations. Today's webinar will be a panel discussion, and I will introduce you to the participants now. All right, our first participant is Lori Mitchell, who is the founder and president of Criterion Edge, a global medical and regulatory writing and safety services firm serving the medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotech industries. Lori has over 20 years of experience in medical writing, safety, and pharmacovigilance management and regulatory reporting. Next is Carolyn Bird. Carolyn is the VP of Regulatory Quality and Clinical for Next Term Innovation and has over 20 years of medical device experience in quality, regulatory, R&D, and operations. For the last 6 years, at Leica Biosystems and Abbott, Carolyn has stood up strategies and programs to enable implementation of the MedDev 2.7 Rev 4 and the EU MDR and IVDR. In her role at NextTerm, she is part of the executive team enabling realization of medical device innovations with valued collaborators at every stage of a device's life cycle for any part of the world where patients are in need. Our third speaker today is Dr. Krishna Sudhir, who is a physician and cardiologist with 30 years experience in cardiovascular medicine and research. As the Divisional Vice President of Medical Affairs and Product Performance at Abbott Vascular in Santa Clara, California, he is responsible for company-wide medical affairs functions as well as worldwide responsibility for product performance. Dr. Sudhir has worked at Abbott Vascular for about 13 years and has provided medical and scientific leadership on spirit, science, and absorbed studies and publications. He is an MD from the University of Madras in India and a PhD from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, and a cardiovascular fellowship from the University of California at San Francisco. Our last and probably most important panelist today is Sydney Collins, who is the inventor of the Next Stride and co-founder and CEO of Deoro Devices. Deoro Devices is a VC-backed, non-invasive medical device startup whose mission is to develop products that help people with mobility disorders walk to improve their independence and quality of life. NextStride, Deoro Devices' first product, is a small portable device that uses research-backed sensory cues to help people with Parkinson's overcome freezing of gait and be able to walk smoothly. Sydney has an academic research background in computational neuroscience with a recent research paper published in the Journal of Clinical Neuropsychology. Sydney was awarded Cal Poly's 2019 Outstanding Woman in Engineering Award, Outstanding Student Award, Lisa Hufford Scholarship Award, and was also identified as one of the most influential women at Cal Poly by The Wire in their 30 Under 30s list, and recognized in many other platforms. All right, with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Carolyn, who is our best panelist to introduce us to why this panel is here to talk about this subject. Take it away, Carolyn.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Mark and I have worked for a long time with Criterion Edge to put together some interesting topics. We've been talking about this for a while with Lori and others. How do we come together and just share some interesting stories and lessons learned to the startup community in particular about how do we get through this product development life cycle? How do we get from idea to launching a product and actually getting it into patients' hands or into use, which is really everyone's ultimate goal here. So as we've been talking about this for a while to come together and have this conversation, we kind of talked about coming together in 3 different buckets. So Sydney's here. You just heard her bio. She is amazing and has this great idea that had to get through development and get to launch somehow. And so she's here to help us on the front end understand, like, how do ideas come up? What enablers helped her through this process? And Lori and I are here on this panel representing that kind of middle ground. We're here in different ways to help through design development, clinical strategy development, informing the device iteration process to help people get out of this ideation and kind of invention mode into what in the end becomes an actual corporation or a company of some kind that's selling and distributing product that's approved by the FDA or wherever around the world you're placing this product. And that experience, Dr. Sudhir here from Abbott Vascular has absolutely ridden this whole train all the way through from those great ideas in a startup and has made it big in the strategic world, the corporate world, and is still very much a part of mergers, acquisitions, portfolio development, organic R&D, all of those things in a strategic company that continue to build the offerings for patients all around the world and physicians. So we're all here to have hopefully what is going to be a very interesting conversation about our lessons learned and how did Sydney just very recently get started with the Oro devices, and then how can we come together and explain how this ecosystems work and get you connected with some additional resources that might be of value to you. So on this next slide, we're going to park here for the rest of the conversation. This is the product development high-level roadmap that literally anybody out there, if you've got an idea, you're going to experience this whole entire life cycle together. And it is definitely a journey. It starts with that discovery and ideation, invention type of process where think tanks, academic institutions, people on the street, you see a need, you fill a need. Everybody out there who wants to experience this together comes up with an idea. Now we've got to get it through the design process, iterate on that thing, prototype it, get through design, development, testing, freezing and unfreezing our design as we go to make sure that we've got the right product to serve the right clinical need that the right problem we're trying to solve. From there, then it's about execution and bringing it through the market. So when we've got the right product, we've got it defined the right way, we've got to go get that clinical evidence to support our hypothesis that this is actually going to provide the outcomes required or that we're pursuing. Once we have that clinical data, we get it through regulatory pathways, whatever that means, all around the world. A lot of times you start maybe in Europe or you'll start in the US. And then over time, that can grow and expand as your company expands. We're launching that product then, getting it out there in the world. And then throughout the whole rest of the life cycle, as long as that product is out there in hands of users, there's going to be experiences that get shared back to you and your company along the way. And the market and the technology and the world around us continuously changes as well. So once your product's on the market, that's the real challenge, is how we continue to monitor that thing and understand its performance and understand where it continues to fit in the clinical continuum that continues to evolve, and how you compare or compete over time with products that continuously enter the market and potentially change that state of the art. So Mark, since we've been talking about this for so long, I know we've had a lot of questions come in as people registered for this. We've had a lot of great conversations amongst us within the panelists. So I'm going to kind of look to you to help guide us in a timely way, because we like to share lots of stories. So if you can kind of guide us through this roadmap, I think we're set up to have a pretty interesting conversation.
Thank you so much, Karen, for that great introduction. Also, just to briefly introduce myself, Mark Grondin. I am the COO at Criterion Edge and also an experienced entrepreneur and founder of a few companies over my 25-year career. So have some experience in this area. So let's start with that. Let's start with founding. I'm going to address this first question to Sydney. Sydney, as you're the one most in the middle of this process, can you walk us through your experience with the process, highlighting things that went well, things that you should have done differently, and where you might have been able to use more knowledge? I mean, that's a big question, but go ahead and give us your experience to start us out.
Yeah, great question, Mark. That's a lot of things I wish I knew at the very beginning. But honestly, I think if I knew everything at the beginning, I might not have pursued it. So I'm kind of happy that I didn't. So let me give you just a little bit of background on how this whole idea came about, and then I can kind of talk through the steps, how this process went for me, and where we're at right now. So to start off, I came up with this idea for the next stride just because I met a local veteran in San Luis Obispo in California. And he lived with freezing of gait. He had no effective solution to help him overcome that symptom of Parkinson's disease. And I really just wanted to use my engineering skills to help somebody in the community. There was no intention of starting a company there. But what ended up happening was, as we created this device for Jack, saw how much it affected his life, how he was able to engage in his life more, to be able to walk, to be able to go to the bathroom by himself, do all these things that he couldn't do before. We saw what a huge impact it had on his life and what a huge impact it could have on other people's lives as well. He was the one who actually brought me to a support group, to a Parkinson's support group, to introduce me to 20, 30 other people who all, again, had this issue and didn't have an effective solution to it. So that's kind of where the idea came from. And I think that type of thing happens a lot. Of people are seeing problems, but they aren't necessarily the ones that are going to go out and actually create a product. There's a lot of like physical therapists that I talk to, a lot of physicians that I talk to, who all see these problems and have these amazing ideas, but they're not going to quit their jobs to go pursue bringing something to market because it's such a huge task. So it ended up being just the perfect combination of, I had an academic research background and decided to step outside of that because I could have a much bigger impact actually getting a product to market rather than staying on the research side. So that covers kind of the idea discovery part of it. We went through this prototype stage multiple times. So just working with Jack on what's working, what's not working, what are the things that we have to change. And there definitely is, you can see kind of this loop around this diagram that we have here, the develop, validate, design, redesign, bench test, that whole loop. That definitely happens over and over and over again before you move forward to any of the regulatory product launch, that part of it. And when I think about our process of going through all of it, so right now we actually are on the market, just to clarify where our product is at. We're on the market, we're doing some post-market surveillance studies, as we always should be. And I don't think that means that we're at the end of this process. I think it means that we've gone through it once and we will go through it again and again and again as we continue to discover what's working and what's not working outside. In general, I'm trying to wrap it up because I know I'm rambling here. In general, I think that the process has been very take 2 steps forward and 1 step back, and 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because as we want to get this product out there, we want to move forward. And then as we go through the process, we realize, oh, there's this red tape that we have to go through. Okay, let's make sure we've got that covered. Or let's get a prototype out that works, but it's not necessarily going to be manufacturable. So then we have to go back and redesign for manufacturability. So I think that in general, there's a lot of efficiency that could have been improved about the process.
Excellent. Where specifically, what support, if you're looking back on what happened, what support would you now say, I wish I would have had this kind of support at this point in the process?
I think at the very beginning, really understanding all of the steps of both on the regulatory side for FDA, for getting our CE mark, understanding all of the processes for our specific product. So we're a class 1 medical device exempt from FDA approval, which is fantastic because it means that we don't have to go through the 510K, we don't have to go through clinical trials to get to market, but really understanding what is the quality management system that has to be in place, understanding what is a 1345 certification, ISO 1345 certification, and what does that mean for us? How do we not only develop the quality management system, but implement it into our daily practice at the very beginning. I think that's something that was missing. Is yes, we understood that there was this quality management system, but actually integrating it into how we run the business every day at the very, very start of the company would have been something that helped a lot in terms of just saving time and money.
Excellent. Well, let's take Sydney off the hot seat for a second. I'm sure everyone appreciated your knowledge. So let's ask Sudhir, Dr. Sudhir, as a person who's seen the process end to end so many times. Can you talk about examples of a company or group who was successful in this process, and what you saw and what you observed there and what made them successful?
Sure. I'll pick an example where success was not guaranteed at the beginning, and that's a device called Microclip. The company in question is a company called eValve that was established in the early 2000s, and was really an idea that a cardiologist, Dr. Fredson Gore, had. He sat down with a very bright engineer, Farrell Powell, the late Farrell Powell, and they worked on it together. They started a company called eValve. We were sitting across the table at Abbott as an early investor, as a backer of this company. And we followed its process through the first 3 or 4 steps you see here: discovery and ideation, invention of the prototype, some preclinical studies, and then the loop that Sydney talked about. You know, there were multiple loops of redesign, bench testing, validation, and so on. We came in when they had some pretty decent clinical data. They completed their first in-human study, and they also had a larger study, a registry in a larger population, both in the US and outside the US. And at that stage, the conversations about acquisition began. We acquired the company in the, I think 2008 to 2010 timeframe. I think the final numbers were agreed to in about 2009 or something like that. And then, eValve became a part of Abbott. It grew into the structural heart arm of Abbott. And, initially, like I said, it was not clear how effective the technology was. I omitted to maintain what the technology is. It's actually a clip. So until this stage, if you had a leaky mitral valve, we call that mitral regurgitation, the treatment is either medical therapy, if you're that far along that you can't withstand surgery, or surgical correction, which could be repair of the valve or replacement of the valve. And Dr. Fredson Gore's design was a percutaneous way of repairing the valve, meaning repairing the valve without surgery. So a very appealing idea, a clear market need for this, because there's huge numbers of patients. They run into the millions globally with mitral regurgitation who are not candidates for surgery, right? So, but initially we took a very narrow approach, we meaning both eValve and Abbott. And then after the acquisition, the structural heart group at Abbott took a really sort of focused approach. And that is, we decided to go after the patients who are unsuitable for surgery. And we call this prohibitive risk of surgery. That's where we got the initial approval by the FDA. The approval was slightly broader in Europe earlier, so we did have some European experience in a larger group of patients, but we got it approved in the US. We took it to other markets like Japan and across the globe and so on, and then slowly expanded out, because the bigger market, it's sort of 25-75, 25% this narrow group of patients at high risk of surgery with a degenerative mitral valve. But there was a very large group of patients where the mitral valve is actually normal, but since they have heart failure and the ventricle expands, you have the secondary mitral regurgitation. We realized early on that this was a much larger group, but that took a huge randomized control study, 622 patients with the FDA, to get approval for that. And that's really opened the door to establishing this as a successful product across the globe. So from inception of the idea to a blockbuster product in the post-market stage, that was about 12 to 14 years. And we're still iterating the product. still improving it in many ways, applying it to other valves like the tricuspid and so on. We've taken the product globally. So I think that's a very interesting success story. Not always clear in the early days that this was going to be the huge success that it was. But, people in the program did everything right. With some setbacks. Sydney mentioned 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I certainly remember those days with this product. And then we are where we are today, where it's really the leading percutaneous intervention for the mitral valve. Back to you, Mark.
Wow, awesome story. Thank you. It's actually a quick question. When you were considering first initially supporting this group and then ultimately acquiring the product, what were the considerations that you guys had that you were looking for that made that company first attractive to support and then ultimately to acquire?
Yeah, I think it was a perfect storm of circumstances. Number one, a huge unmet market need because these patients often sit around at home and just get progressively worse. And there's nothing they could do because the surgeons would not take them, right? So there was the unmet market need. There's a huge group of patients. Like I said, the numbers run into tens of millions globally who require a procedure like this, an alternative to surgery. And we were able to prove in the FDA trial that this is superior to medical therapy sitting at home. And then there was the fact that Abbott really wanted to get into the structural heart space. We were slow to get into the TAVR space, the aortic valve space. Edwards and Medtronic had stolen a march on us, and other companies were already entering the space. But the mitral valve space was wide open, and we ended up being the earliest in that space and now leading that space. So the combination of an attractive product, a cardiologist and an engineer getting together, designing the product, some clinical data, and then the other side of the coin was we really wanted to get into the space. We didn't want to be a third or fourth or fifth player in the aortic space. We wanted to be the first player in another space, and the mitral space was, like I said, available. The door was open there, and we were able to, put those two together, take advantage of it, and run with it.
Awesome. Thank you for that insight. We're going to leave you on the hot seat and talk a little bit about the other side. To balance this out a little, let's talk about, or can you talk about an example of a failure that ran during this process? Have you seen like a great idea flop, and what kind of lessons can you give our audience from that?
Yeah, I mean, several really. I mean, this is a tough space, right? Innovation is a tough space. 1 in 10, or I don't know what the exact figure is, maybe 1 in 15 of these ideas will actually work in the end, maybe even less. But you have to, if you believe in the idea, you have to stay with it. And then having failures doesn't mean that you won't have future success. Within the same program, Microclip is an example of that, where we had some early failures, but then it went on to be successful. But you might have a device that fails and then comes back in a new iteration, comes back to a different set of patients. People realized why the device actually failed with, good high-level failure analyses and so on. A case in point, which I feel it wasn't our company, it was another company, Medtronic, the RDN case. Renal denervation is a wonderful concept. There's patients with hypertension the world over. And if you had a device that treated patients, at least with resistant hypertension, that is, hypertension, high blood pressure that's not amenable to drug therapy, then, you'll have really millions and millions and millions of patients who are eligible for this device. And Medtronic had a very successful first-in-human study. They had a very successful follow-up study, in a small number of patients, can't remember the exact number, maybe 100, a couple of hundred, where this looked really promising. But then when they went to the pivotal trial, it failed. It was really no different from placebo. And the failure analysis, or looking backwards, the wisdom of hindsight showed this is not necessarily the easiest device to use. Training is required, but in the actual clinical trial, in the actual pivotal study, many of the physicians were using it for the first time. And that's something you don't want. You don't want physicians to be testing a device for the first time in your pivotal trial, right? Either you want a lead-in phase, or you want to select physicians who use the device earlier in the phase 2 study, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the company, to its credit, realized all these mistakes. They went back in now with a fresh set of eyes, And I believe that the technology eventually will be successful in some form. We're kind of waiting on the sidelines as a company to see what happens with the whole technology. But that's a technology that had initial success and then a failed pivotal trial, if you like, in pharma terminology. That's a phase 3 trial. But the market need is so strong, and the belief that something in the space is going to work is so strong that you'll probably see it come back in some way. It's now radio frequency ablation. People are trying other things like cryo and injections and all that. So maybe there'll be modification to the actual therapy, modifications to the actual device. But like I said, the global market is so huge that, the 50, 60 startup companies in that space who kind of, took a beating after the failed trial, some of them have not gone away, and some of them will come back in some shape or form when the therapy returns.
So even those failures could turn into very viable acquisitions and ultimately solutions, sounds like.
Exactly, especially if people learn from, if people do the failure analysis and learn from, what worked and what didn't, with the wealth of data available out there from the earlier studies.
All right, awesome. All right, let's turn that, we'll get a question out there for Caroline. Let me just remind the audience as well, please feel free to type your questions into the question bar at the bottom of your screen. We will definitely get to questions at the end, but we might seed some of those questions into the middle of the discussion as well. So please, at any time you have them, please type them into that area. So Carolyn, as someone who's in Minnesota, I can't remember, they call it the Medical Alley. Is that what am I saying?
Medical Alley here in
Alley.
Minnesota.
So we've heard about innovation in places like that, like the Medical Alley or even Silicon Valley. Do you think there's like a secret sauce to those areas and Minnesota, talk about other places like them? And what is that? And why is it maybe important to be there or be associated with them?
Sure, yeah. Well, Minnesota and Silicon Valley and the West Coast both have just been tremendous hubs of innovation over time. Medtronic was founded here by Earl Bakken, and there are institutions here like the Bakken Museum that house a lot of medical innovation from centuries ago even that continue to inspire inventors even today. With these crazy, like Dr. Sudhir was saying, there's some things that get tried in history over time, and they are perhaps colossal flops, but there's something to be learned there that you can pull forward. And, I think there's just an awful lot of resources that have been grasped onto that passion for medical device innovation. St. Jude Medical, Boston Scientific is housed here in Minnesota. There's quite a few startup companies and component manufacturers and people who've just been in this industry for a while that we've created quite the ecosystem here in the Twin Cities to make these connections that young inventors or early entrepreneurs need to find their success and help connect those dots. And it's interesting because like Lori and I, we've worked together across multiple different companies over time because the med device community just is so small. She's in California, I'm in Minnesota, and we've worked across at least 3 different companies together. So anyway, I just think there's also the trade association. So like Medical Alley here in Minnesota is a perfect one. Sydney, you came out of Cal Poly's in kind of an invention hopper system. There's a lot of these communities that are built up both in California and Minnesota that really are passionate about bringing great ideas to the market and helping people find that pathway through, make those connections, get creative with funding, make those introductions, like an eValve kind of situation, perfect fit for an Abbott very early on, or like Sydney, she needs venture capital funds to come in. How can we help through that? And then some of those lessons learned, like establishing a quality system and the way in which you're going to design and develop and deliver your product very, very early on in your company. Those are kind of services that companies like Nextern, where I work, we're able to step in and help you craft those things, help you put those in place, because we have employees who've been there, done that on literally hundreds of devices over our careers. So there's so much help out there, so many places you can start. The most important thing, I think, is just to start and start using a network, start reaching out, go to, Minnesota has Minnesota Startup Week coming up in September. I'm sure Lori could probably, or Mark, you guys could name 100 other equivalent things happening out in the California time zone, where people just need to reach out and take advantage of those things. And the help is here. We're ready to assist anyone who's got these great ideas.
Yeah, Sydney, can you talk a little bit about how you tapped into help? I know you're located about 2.5 hours south of Silicon Valley, so not in the Silicon Valley. You had local help. Have you tapped into Silicon Valley or other areas? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I also wanted to just underline what Caroline was saying in terms of the resources that are needed to be successful. I think so much of what has helped us, and when I look back at the people that I talked to, the resources that I was able to get, was talking to people that have done it before. And I think that going off of the question that you were asking before, Mark, I think that's what makes these hubs successful. That's why we get so much innovation out of Silicon Valley, out of Minnesota, Medical Alley. I think it's getting resources to the people that have done it before, and how important that knowledge is, I don't think can be understated. So sorry, back to your question, Mark. The resources that we were able to get, I think, so I started this company while I was still in school at Cal Poly, and Cal Poly's Innovation Center is they're very focused on being able to help more medical devices specifically get to market, because we're the second medical device that's ever come out of the Cal Poly Innovation Entrepreneurship Program. The first one was actually just sold for over $200 million. So they're pretty excited about that. But we're the second medical device to ever come out, and they really want to understand what are the resources that are needed to help companies be successful. And I think a big portion of it, I mean, we were able to get the resources that we need so far, just through connections, and not necessarily all through Cal Poly, but you meet people through Cal Poly and they know somebody that's done this before, or that can connect you to this contractor. You know, we were introduced through Cal Poly to an investor who knew, somebody who has done the product development before. The person that helped us with product development connected us to our manufacturing facility. Everybody's interconnected that way. And I think just the advisors and the mentors, those types of resources were extremely valuable. And then of course, access to capital is always necessary to get a medical device out to market.
So let's sort of going on to that, Caroline, let's talk a little bit, as someone who's involved in helping companies form based on ideas, and what, in your opinion, should startups be thinking about in that early stage to prepare them for later stages that they probably are not thinking about yet? They don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, that's the biggest nut to crack is, what's the end? Where are you trying to go? What problems are you trying to solve? I was thinking about Dr. Sudhir's examples of successes and failures too. Sometimes I think people come in with this hot idea that they're going to save the world, and it's like really big aspirations. And those things, when you get into them, if you think about what you have to go through to get these big claims, big patient populations, or something very large, it's not going to be a success when you get into the clinical and regulatory space. On the flip side too, if you start too tiny with something, it may be really easy. Okay, we're going to have this very streamlined, simple clinical path, but then you've got something in the end that you can't really market anywhere because you have no claims, you have no data to really stand on to place it in the marketplace or position it within the state of the art, supported with data that will entice people to actually come forth and try your technology or buy your technology. So Lori and I actually are partnered on some really early innovation things happening with some clients here at Nextern, for example, that are trying to scope themselves out. They've got these great ideas, and we could take it this way or that way, or up and down, and big and small. And so we have to rely a lot on clinical literature reviews and understanding the state of the art and what publications are already out there that we can leverage to help support the assumptions that are being made by the inventors. Or maybe they're hanging their hat on one piece of information and not even realizing there's a lot of other data out there that may drive them in a completely different way. And they don't know that unless they partner with the right resources and people and go through that exercise of really understanding those experiences that have happened out in the world over time to inform their decisions to make that clinical pathway a success. If you don't design your trial right, if you don't have those requirements right, and you try to bite off too much or too little off the bat, that can sink or swim a whole marketplace or a whole technology space. So, this, I can't emphasize enough, like, you got to understand what you're going to go through on the back end. And so you can account for those requirements very early on, but getting those requirements right early on, that's where you got to spend your time and energy. And that do loop, it's real and it's necessary for sure at the beginning.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in and just say and add to your comments, Caroline, that finding the right help and inserting that help in the right spot in that feedback loop and in that continuum is important. Criterion Edge is a supporter of work. We don't come up with the ideas. We support the people that have the ideas as they move through this particular channel. And, we support with regulatory writing and systematic literature reviews, among other services. And what Caroline is referring to is a company that Nextern is supporting. They're in early phase and they have questions. They don't really know what's out there in the universe or in the published arena. And because our company has the ability to conduct very robust systematic literature reviews to answer questions early on. In other words, let's not go down this path. The data shows us maybe we need to go through another path, for example. So those types of focused interventions, you never know where you need the help or where help is best inserted. So for example, folks with great ideas that need to take it to the next level and need to find out more about the marketplace or more about the competition or more about the technology, any of those types of things. How do you find that out? Well, you start looking in, say, published literature, systematic literature review. Who does that? Well, we do. Mm-hmm. So it's that type of finding the right services at the right time and inserting them strategically in very important times during this continuum keeps the ball rolling forward. And that, I think that's what we're talking about too, is, we also support with regulatory writing. So at some point along that pathway, as you're getting into the blue, the yellow and the blue there's writing that needs to be done, and 510K submissions, for example, or IND submissions, expert reviews, systematic literature reviews. Who puts that gas in your engine? So it's those other types, the other types of support companies that are out there to help. We've been talking about the quality management system. We've talked regulatory strategy, those types of reaching out beyond your great idea to help nurture that great idea through ideation to sale, to putting in patients' hand is the dream of every Sydney Collin out there. Is like, I've got a great idea, I created something, and for that person, the culmination of that idea really is to see patients who need it use it successfully. And it takes a village to get
so
to
Lori,
that.
you always have the problem of you don't know what you don't know, right? Like, so especially for someone like Sydney, probably Sydney, you can talk to, coming out of university, she didn't know what she didn't know. She didn't know what you need. So what would you suggest? Like, how do you get to the point where you find out what you don't know, and where you and who can help you, and where you can go to get that help? How do you go down that path, you think?
Well, where you can go to get the help, I think, is the second step of that. Is first, I guess, is to understand what help you need. And, I think, again, if you begin to think about taking things to the next level, and early intervention, I think getting some good mentors, Caroline's company, Next Turn, is a great, spot where you can, and those questions can be asked. They're a great resource to say, oh, you have this problem. Well, we need to hook you up with this company or this skill to get you on your company unstuck and to the next level. And so that those early interventions, and I can give one example. We're regulatory writers. We're very deep in the medical device space. MDR, for those of you that are out there as medical device folks, you know what the MDR, medical device regulation, is. It's taken effect in Europe. And one of the things that the MDR has driven the medical device space to think about early on are safety and performance objectives. And those defining, in other words, the state of the art of your device, in the state of the art milieu in which your device exists, defining that, and then defining how you measure the safety and performance of your device. What are those objectives, those data points, if you will, that need to be identified early on and then traced throughout the continuum? So there's a question early on, who would have thought of that? But once you begin to set down something like, how am I going to measure the safety and performance of my device? Then you design your clinical trials around that, your protocols, your plans, your post-market surveillance. So who would have thought that you needed to think about that so early? But sometimes early intervention is the best because it sets up the framework for moving forward. Because at the end of the day, we're all slave to the data collection, the data, the strength of the data, what it shows, and where it directs you. So that's one example of early intervention and early insertion of other companies or skills that you may need.
Cindy, as someone in the middle, great, you're jumping it. How did you clear up those things you don't know? You didn't know you didn't know.
I just want to, again, underline what Lori's saying and the importance of getting that involved really early on in the company so that you can plan and budget accordingly. I think nobody who isn't in the medical device world is going to be able to do research online and figure out exactly, how much money, what are the steps that we have to go through. I think bringing in advisors and mentors and companies like Criterion Edge and like Next Turn that have the resources and have done it over and over and over again is absolutely critical in being able to accurately plan and foresee what the time and money allocation should be to be able to get a device to market. And of course, you spend all of this time planning and budgeting and trying to make sure that you have something that's accurate as possible. And then you have to double the time and double the money because everything is going to go wrong. Nothing's going to go according to plan.
Sydney, as writers, we always say, oh, you think that's going to take 2 months? Double that. That's really not true. If you think time is the master of us all, so that's we live and die by timelines, so keep going, but that's the time is the master of us all.
It's very true.
Mm-hmm.
I wish I had known that at the beginning.
Okay,
Double all your
you go.
timelines. Double all of the budget that you think you need.
That's right.
And I also quickly, while I'm talking about something that Lori said, I want to go back to something that Caroline brought up. When you were talking about strategically looking at, okay, what are the studies that we want to do? What's the market that we want to go after with this product? I do think there's a lot of thought that needs to go into that, because as you said, if you go after too many markets at once, you can fail at all of them. But if you go after a smaller market, then a lot of the times it's not going to be as exciting to venture capitalists, and you're not going to be able to grow as fast. And so finding the balance there, I think, is really important. And we had a lot of conversations about this and decided to really go after a smaller market so that we can be successful, get the device to market as fast as possible, penetrate that market before expanding into these other areas that we can go into with this product. But we're now at the stage where, so I mentioned that we don't have to do clinical trials to get to market. However, we are doing clinical trials to get CMS coverage, insurance coverage for our product. So we're looking at, okay, even though we're only marketing in this market right now, do we want to develop the clinical study that includes all of these other disease states in it? And if it does, how does that change the metrics that we're looking at? Is there a way that we can create these metrics that are going to show efficacy in all of these different disease states? Or do we have to create separate studies and just run them all at the same time? So that's, all of that strategic thinking behind who do we include in the study? When do we do it? How big is the study? Are we focusing? Are we going broader? Is so helpful to have somebody who's done it before and who has gone through, failed many times in the past and can then use that knowledge to help people in the future be more successful. Sorry, Mark, I'm not sure if I actually answered your question.
That was a super point. Yeah, that whole thing, again, she's outlining the strategy is like penetrating a more focused market. Gathering data really is code sort of what you said, Sydney, is like you're gathering data in your focused market and ideas are beginning to grow. It's like, okay, this is looking successful. What are the applications beyond your focused indication for use? And then how can you apply that technology to other focused areas? And what data do you need to gather in subsequent trials that will underpin, the expansion of your indications or going after a 510K?
And I do think that there's something else here that we haven't addressed in terms of actually getting a medical device to market. We look at all of the regulatory pathway, we look at all the red tape here through the FDA, through QMS, all of these other, gateways that we have to go through to be able to get a medical device to market. But something that we haven't talked about is actually the funding side of it as well. I could sit down, Lori and Caroline and I could sit down and create the plan from the very beginning of, okay, this is how long it's going to take, this is how much money it's going to take, these are all the resources we need to get this device to market. But that plan changes when you actually consider going out and raising money. Because to be able to raise money, you need to be able to hit these certain milestones, to be able to show proof of concept, to be able to de-risk parts of the company that is going to show the investor that we can be successful and that we can hit these milestones, that we can actually get a product into somebody's hands, show that it's effective, and then have to go back and redesign the whole thing. And so we end up not working on this linear path that even if we had all the knowledge and all the resources in the world, we could be as efficient as possible. But because I then have to go raise money at certain points, I'm going as fast as I can to hit this milestone. And then I have to go back and redesign a little bit and go as fast as I can to hit this next milestone so that I can fund the company along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Another point to add to that, sorry, Mark, is we can think more globally now. And if there's anything I've learned in 15 years at Abbott is we don't have to be so US focused, Western Europe focused, Japan focused, which is what the teaching was 15 years ago, right? You got your product approved in Europe, then you brought it to the US, and finally you got approval in at least one Asia Pac country, namely Japan. The world has changed substantially, and we talked about Silicon Valley and we talked about Minneapolis, but there are many Silicon Valleys now in Tel Aviv and Shanghai and Taipei and Mumbai and so on, which are doing pretty much what Silicon Valley was doing 10, 15 years ago, but maybe on a smaller scale. There's funding available in those countries. The country of Singapore funds a lot of research through Asia and Southeast Asia and so on. I'll give you one example. We have a diabetic product called Libre, which is really a skin patch with a little sensor that monitors your subcutaneous blood glucose continuously for 14 days and sends a signal to your doctor's iPhone or your iPhone for that matter, or a laptop, right? The product was actually first launched in India because there's a huge diabetic population. There was a desire of Indian physicians to start using the product very quickly. And we were able to get a huge amount of clinical data from India before even thinking about entering the European and US markets. Now it's a global product, but it was actually first launched, and this was the first for Abbott at the time, a product that was first launched in India. And we're doing more and more of that now, thinking more in terms of global products, and maybe we'll just launch in a certain part of the world where it makes the most sense, rather than the FDA can take its time. No criticism there; it's got its own regulations, and now with EU MDR changes that Caroline talked about in her introduction, that takes more time. The Japanese and the Chinese have their long processes and so on. So in which parts of the world can we get a product in quickly and still have high quality clinical data that can be presented to Western Europe, Japan, and the US FDA, right? So that's changed our thinking a lot in the last 5 years or so.
Mm-hmm.
So I hate to point out we're getting down on time. We've probably covered about a third of our topic area. So maybe we'll be able to get this dream team back together to do this again. But let me let's go into the, I can't remember what they call it on Jeopardy, the rapid question and answer period, so we can capture some of the questions from the audience.
The lightning round.
The lightning round, yeah.
The lightning round, all right.
Keep it short.
Here's the first one coming in from the audience. What are some of the most important sources of information, such as medical literature or market research, that you'd consider in establishing your initial device specifications? That's probably you, Lori.
Yeah, Lori, maybe just the peer-reviewed literature.
Systematic literature review, looking at particular parts of defining what the state of the art is for your particular device. In other words, who are your competitors? What are the indications for use? What are the other types of products that are out there, and indication treatments for the disease state or therapeutic area that you're after? Professional guidelines, look for professional guidelines and other, global guidelines is another. Establish those safety and performance objectives early on. Look for those in professional guidelines. In other words, if you're developing a new something, go to that professional website and how would they measure the success of a device in that particular for that particular disease state. With it, what would be the safety and what would be the performance? So that's where you would look. You would start there. You need to start. The world is a big place, and there's a lot of information out there. And if you can partner well with someone who can do a very robust search beyond just the internet's a great place to start, but it only allows you to touch some things, and it doesn't give you a lot of searching power, which means that you could go out to the internet and do this and get 5,000 articles, where if you're doing a systematic literature review using Boolean search terms and mesh terminology and so forth, and a whole search strategy, that 5,000 shrinks to 500 very good focused articles. So that's one thing. That's my thought on that.
Well, one other thing that I would add is, right through the process, starting with innovation and then ending up with an exit strategy like acquisition, or from our side of the table where we are acquiring the company. What I found really useful is talking to people, especially physicians and engineers who've used the product, right? So we're in this game now with innovation number 4 for a product that has had 3 prior innovations. So I want to talk to all the physicians who've used the product before so they can tell me, what was missing. I want to talk to engineers who worked on these products earlier and said, gee, I wish I'd had this additional feature of the gizmo to make it more successful, right? So that very quickly sort of shortens your time for understanding the product. And I've learned a lot through these conversations. Before an acquisition, we usually try to talk to 30, 40, 50 physicians who've used the product. And we tried to talk to supporters who've used the product in clinical trials, as well as skeptics who say this product will never work, because you want to get both sides of the equation in your understanding. So in addition to what Laurie was saying, a thorough understanding of the literature, what's out there, what's been published, and so on, I have benefited enormously personally from these conversations one-on-one with physicians and engineers who have far more knowledge of the product than I do and can give me kind of first-hand knowledge of it. And don't forget to include the skeptics in that list, because it's important to get their perspectives as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. We call it, Sydney's probably heard this term many times. We call that goobing, G-O-O-B, getting out of the building and going and talking to people, right? If you get too caught up in your computer, you forget that there's a world out there that can give you all sorts of advice. All right, we got another question. How important is it to tell a good story to a regulatory body about your product? They said, we just got some major non-conformances in an audit due to questions about the scope of our submission. Laurie or Carolyn, you have any insight on that? I know it's very specific.
Yeah, well, I always say that is regulatory and quality's role. Actually, we're storytellers. Yeah. We take all the information in and we take all the data that, and look at tons and tons of information, but how do you summarize it? How do you get a lay person or even a technical person who understands the therapeutic space? They got to get in your head. So how do you write something, succinctly, but
and coherently.
Yeah, exactly. Just say, I started here, we learned this literature or this data tells us this, so then we went here, and now here's this set of data that supports that. And it's very much about telling a story. Just even in a quality system audit, you had an issue come up and you got to tell the story around a CAPA. Same thing. What happened? What investigation did you do that got you to a root cause? What did you do about it? Prove to me that it's done. Right. Like, it's all about telling a story.
It's all about the story.
That's what your submission is too.
I always say about a story is start at the beginning, go to the middle, get to the end, and stop. In other words, know when to start, what you're going to say, and when you get to the end, stop talking. Yeah. And it's a little bit of that too. So yeah, that's those are our
in mind, Laurie. We've reached our time.
What's that?
We've used our hour and we now have to stop.
Oh, is it time to stop talking?
So I want to thank you all panelists so much for your valuable insight. Again, like I said, we got through a little over a third of what we wanted to, so there's a lot more we can talk, and maybe if there's interest, you, the audience, can let us know, and we'd love to run this again and see if we can get this panel back together. In the meantime, what you see in front of you is the contact information for the various parties, and you will be getting a copy of this recording in your email. If you have any questions or we didn't get to your questions, feel free to reach out to us after this webinar, and we thank you all for attending. We hope you enjoyed and got value out of this session. Thank you, panelists.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.